Up next from Duo Security is Sean Frazier, Advisory CISO. Go ahead, Sean.
Hey y'all, my name is Sean Frazier, Advisory CISO for Duo Security, now part of Cisco. I work mostly with our public sector folks, but spend a fair amount of time talking to everyone around the country about security. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the fast rate of change that we're experiencing in our security models based upon the fact that we're all kind of teleworking or working remotely. About 10 years ago in DC, this thing happened called Snowmageddon, where we had this large snowstorm that really wasn't predicted, and it caused us to think a lot about how we would provide telework services or services to applications to users who could not come to the office. It also did something else. It actually prompted my move from Washington, D.C. to the West Coast because I did not want to deal with snow like this anymore. But it really kind of made us think hard about how we would provide consistent level of services and how we'd kind of get back to normal in a time where folks were forced to kind of work from home or telework. Fast forward to today, and now we're living kind of an extreme example of this. And as much as we all want to get back to normal and get back to our office friends and get back to the water cooler conversations, this has forced us to think about how we deliver capabilities and services when we're not able to do that. We also want to get back to the good technology or the work technology that allowed us to get our work done. And sometimes that has become problematic and has been a challenge for the organizations, especially when we find ourselves kind of blast out of a cannon and having to do all this stuff immediately, having to scale up all of our services to provide access to users to come back inside the network, whether that be VPNs or firewalls, or whether we needed to scale up some of our cloud services or SaaS-based services because we really had not anticipated or had not been able to plan for this event where users are going to be hitting those services at a large scale from a lot of different places. And it really has kind of forced us to think about what our environments were like and how much legacy we had and how we really were kind of just holding the stuff together with baling wire and twine. And we really needed to think more holistically about the environments we were providing to provide a scalable environment for users to have access. And it also required us to think about our security model. So that our security model was consistent across these types of accesses and wasn't kind of a square peg in a round hole when it came to, hey, it works one way inside the firewall and it works a completely different way outside the firewall. Because that's something that we really need to think about hard, is how do we provide a holistic security model that's consistent so our user experience is the same. Because at the end of the day, that's the one thing we always have to kind of consider and think about. Is what is the end user experience like? What is it, how does the user get access to the things they need? And are we providing that capability in a holistic way? Are we providing it in a way that's conducive to the way users work? Or are we just kind of getting in the way and causing our users an inordinate amount of pain? Obviously, we don't want to do this. And we're also kind of keeping an eye on the future, right? We're thinking about, well, what does this telework situation look like 5 years from now or 10 years from now, when we have kind of a handle on the ebb and flow of users, but I'm actually thinking about providing this as an ongoing capability. I kind of liken this to, a decision that a user will make when they come into the organization. Do you give them a MacBook or do you give them a Chromebook? A user should be able to choose based upon their lifestyle, their caregiver situation, based upon the environment, all these different things. A user should be able to say, do I work from home? Do I hybrid? Do I work from home part of the time? Or do I come into the office? What is the best way for that individual to work? And providing this capability and this kind of environment or this architecture that will allow that will allow the user who wants to work from home to be able to do that. And again, that consistent user experience so that the user can work the same whether they're inside the network or outside the network. Now, it's important to point out that the perimeter is dead, gone. It's been gone for a while for a few different reasons I'll get into. But if we figured out anything this year, we figured out that the perimeter doesn't exist anymore. It's just, you can't, and you certainly can't hang your security hat on the fact that there was a perimeter, and you can't put your security constructs in the network layer anymore. The network has really just become a pipe, a way to get bits from point A to point B. Is really not a way to decide the way security works. So now there are certain things that you certainly absolutely want to protect from a network perspective. You want strong DNS security. You want strong encryption from end to end. Those things will always be true, but you can't provide kind of access level conversations around security that have anything to do with the perimeter anymore. And it's actually been that way for a while. It really started 10 years ago with the kind of acceleration into cloud adoption of application delivery, as well as the acceleration of mobile as an endpoint access method. This has really kind of forced us to think differently, because the applications now outside the network, the users are more mobile than ever. They're now outside the network, and even if they're not, their device tends to be on the cellular network, or the applications that the device uses tend to be outside the network. So we've the last 10 years had to think about how we're going to do this. And then things like 5G will accelerate this. So now the network's outside the network, right? You're no longer providing the network service or capability for your users anymore. So at the end of the day, what does an organization do? If you're an airline, you're not an IT organization, right? You probably will focus your efforts better on providing good customer service for people who travel in the air. And we look around all the organizations in the world. A lot of organizations have a very large IT footprint. They've got data centers, they've got servers that they manage, they've got a large staff to manage those things. And really, at the end of the day, that's not their core business. So I think a lot of these things are accelerating the inevitable of organizations having to think about what they really care about. And this is accelerating things as well. The kind of acceleration of application delivery of capability in the cloud, right? So do you want to, host a bunch of servers in your data center to provide collaboration when you could just let Cisco or Zoom or Microsoft do that? Probably not, because they're much better at it. And not only are they better at it in terms of service delivery, but it's also scalability. So if we run into an event where overnight everyone's got to work from home, Cisco and Microsoft are certainly a lot better able to scale those services overnight than you ever would be, right? You can't send enough people to a data center to rack enough servers in order to deal with that onslaught of traffic. So relying on these SaaS services is important from a continuity perspective and a scalability perspective. And what that allows us to do, it allows us to think about what we do care about at the end of the day, which is access, user access to applications, and the application as being the delivery mechanism for serving up data. And this is really what kind of a zero trust lifestyle is all about. It's all about really focusing the organization on the thing that matters most, that core piece of information that is your organization, and it really ends up being the data. So providing that consistent access I talked about earlier. So a user accessing an application, it looks pretty much the same whether they're inside the firewall or outside the firewall, or a hybrid of both, making sure that end user experience is consistent. And making sure that at the end of the day, that's what you're focused on as an organization. You're focused on protecting that data, shrinking the attack surface to its lowest able thing, which ends up again being that data. So that way you don't have to boil the ocean and protect every living thing that exists on the internet, because you could not do that. And we're all living in the same neighborhood now. We're all living in the internet neighborhood. So this allows us to kind of simplify our security stack. It allows us to simplify what we're really focused on, and ends up being the data. There are a few things we need to think about as we do this. First of all, it is a journey. It is a lifestyle, as I mentioned. This is not something that you just flip a switch and you're magically protected and everything works. Far from it. Because again, even though we're not all IT companies, we all do have IT, and we all have a lot of applications. And it's important to realize that as you're embarking on this journey, there's a lot of legacy things that you'll have to work with. There are a lot of things you'll need to wire up. There's a lot of consideration about what your application upgrade and migration path is as you modernize your architecture. What does it look like? Can you pack the security in so that security helps you today, but it also enables that bridge to the future? These are all things you need to consider, because as I mentioned earlier, we're all living in environments where there's a ton of legacy. Even organizations like Google and other, kind of born on the cloud organizations have legacy. If you've been around for more than 12 months, you have legacy. So being able to build an architecture that works within that construct, within that framework, and then enabling kind of the next step in that migration or that modernization is super important. So you need to pick technologies that work together in near seamless fashion. And the way you do that is you pick technologies that leverage open standards. You pick technologies that leverage common ways to talk, whether they be APIs or other things. So you need to make sure that you're thinking about this, because you don't want to box yourself in to a single vendor, and you don't want to box yourself into things that don't work together, because we've got plenty of examples where that just, that's just a waste of money, a waste of effort, and a waste of kind of energy in order to secure the organization. So part of this is a journey, right? So we always talk about kind of where do I start in that journey, and typically the way I like to look at this is I'm kind of a guy who looks at what's already there, what's already existing. I don't view any of this as kind of a rip and replace conversation. I don't view any of this as, hey, I can throw everything out and start from scratch, because no one has the ability to do that. So you look at where you have things in place already that you can leverage. So users are a natural place to start because you already have an inventory of users. You have Azure AD, Active Directory, LDAP. You already kind of know where they are, what they are. People log in using that. Whether that's those technologies or whether it's some kind of single sign-on technology. Those are pretty well defined. So being able to kind of start with that as you're thinking about your zero trust lifestyle tends to be a very natural place. And then the next natural place is the next area where we tend to have inventories and already kind of existing systems like MDM and EMM, and that's the device piece. So start with the figuring out, mapping your users to devices, mapping the devices to access, creating and looking at these inventories and making sure you know kind of where things are and what is being used to access what applications. Then the next piece is provide kind of a view into the posture of that, right? So enabling the device trustworthiness. And we're doing this continuously. We're doing this every single time a user is accessing something, again, balancing kind of user experience with access. But we're making sure that the device has all the bare minimum things that it needs in order to access something, right? So its encryption is turned on, the device is not rooted, the device things are enabled around biometric. Those things are important, and being able to detect that every time a user tries to request access to an application or to data is super important. And then making sure these things are adaptive, right? They're not monolithic. You don't put something in, there is no concept really of set it and forget it, right? You're looking at the things that users will do and request, and some of this might be user behavior, right? Behavior might dictate an adaptive policy. The policy might change based upon a user's behavior or a device posture. So being able to have kind of that flexible capability on policies and being able to have that be as dynamic as possible and as automated as possible as well, so that users aren't constantly going in and changing policies and adapting policies based upon the user behavior day in and day out, because that would just be way too cumbersome. So this way the policy engine, or the trust engine if you will, can be adaptive, and it can be kind of be automated to allow user access. And then once you've gotten these things in place, obviously, the zero trust lifestyle or journey is never ending. This is something that will live with you and be part of your security DNA for as long as you have security DNA. So you need to make sure you plan for that. As new applications come in, as new devices come in, as new crops of users come in, you have to be able to kind of make sure that these things apply to all of the things that change in your environment. And by the way, everything changes in your environment all the time. So the last thing I'll mention, which I think is worth mentioning because we always tend to forget about this, is that culture matters, culture counts. And having a security culture kind of baked into the DNA of an organization is super important. And this comes in a few different flavors. It comes in the flavor of security is all of our jobs. All of our IT folks do security. Security is part of our user experience. So the users have to be part of the security journey. They have to be aware. They have to, user training is important around security. Making sure that when, it doesn't matter whether they mop floors, it doesn't matter whether they do in the call center, it doesn't matter whether they're knowledge workers. Everyone in the organization has to have an understanding of what the security of that organization is and what's important to that organization with regards to protecting its assets and its data. So this is super important. And it's important from an end user perspective too, because you have to provide users with cool capability and easy to use capability with regards to security. You can't make this stuff hard. We spend a lot of our time as security practitioners building up walls and trying to make things difficult for attackers. And in most cases, we do a pretty good job of that, but we're also building up walls in front of our users, and we're making it harder for users to be productive. And that's just not a good way for a security model to be implemented. So as we do these things like device posture, and we do things like multi-factor authentication, making sure that the users are part of that conversation, making sure that users have an ability to self-service, because a help desk call isn't good for anybody. It's not good for the organization because it costs money. It's also not good for the users, because I don't know about you guys, but I hate calling someone for help, and I don't want to pick up the phone unless I absolutely have to, and hopefully I don't have to. So we want to make sure that users have the ability to kind of self-service themselves through issues. If their device is out of date, their software is out of date, help them in a way that's it's in line, it's in stream to the request that they're making. It's not something that they have to go outside of the request and do a whole lot of work. They don't have to pick up the phone and call anybody, because nobody wants that. It's also important to do these things every single time, as I mentioned. So we're looking at the security posture of devices, the endpoint access capabilities. We want to make sure that we're looking at kind of the bare minimum, like the 5 or 6 things we really care about for a device. And this is very important for devices across the board, whether they're owned by the organization or whether they're BYO. We need to make sure that the device meets the bare minimum for our security posture as an organization. So is encryption turned on? Is the software up to date? Is the device rooted or jailbroken, meaning is it compromised? Have they leveraged and turned on their strong biometric for authentication? These are all important things that we would want to know, and we want to help the user fix it if they're not, right? So if the user hasn't enabled Touch ID or Face ID, and that's a requirement for our adaptive policy, then let's make sure we can help the user do that in the simplest way possible. Again, it's all about reducing the friction. We have to add some friction to this process. It's just there's no way around that. But how can we reduce the friction and take as much friction out of this conversation as we possibly can? It's also important to leverage things that the users are comfortable with, right? So I talked about Touch ID and Face ID and biometric, whether it be on a Samsung device or an Apple device or a Microsoft device or a Chromebook. Leveraging those things that users use in their personal lives day to day just makes things easier. It makes things easier from the perspective of the user already knows how to use it. There's not a lot of training involved, so we can just go. It also makes it better because the user actually trusts these things, right? I mean, I use my watch and Apple Pay and my biometric all the time to do financial transactions. So if I can trust it with that, I should be able to trust it inside my organization to get access to the applications and the data I need to do my job. So leveraging these things is kind of a double win. It's a double win because the security of these things is strong, but it's another win because we've again provided a better end user experience for access to the corporate network and to the corporate data that these users need to do every single day. And that's all I have. Thank you very much for joining. Take care.